I love horror movies. They're unique in the experiences that they give us, from the overzealous enjoyment over depicted misery, non-stop laughs at antics that should ordinarily be frightening, to lingering thoughts of dread that keep us up at night. The horror genre provides a great deal to keep our imaginations going. In particular, the subject of monsters is what my mind goes to when I think of these films. I love the different shapes they take, the different motives they have, and the ways in which they operate. It's wonderfully terrifying just how much diversity there is in terror that a monster can provide. And I have to ask myself, what are some of the scariest monsters that I can think of? Well, when it comes down to it, for the interest of time, I've separated my thoughts into 3 distinct categories to determine the answer. First off, I think an effective monster needs to elicit some form of primal fear in us. Something that we dread happening. For me, the topic of cannibalism comes to mind. I think Night of the Living Dead, which is one of my favorite films of all time. The notion that there is a horde of flesh-eating monsters just waiting to sink their teeth into you fills me with abject terror. And yet what I think can make this scarier is if there's some slight form of intelligence to the monster, coupled with an appearance that can be described as humanoid. For as terrifying as, let's say, the xenomorph in Alien is, you can still see aspects of humanity in it, aspects of a beast that relies not just on instinct, but also on tactics. Something that can hunt you relentlessly because it wants to. Finally, I think about where the monster can be encountered, and for this, I think there's no more terrifying a place than where you can tell that you just shouldn't go. This can range from a number of locales, from frozen wastes in The Thing to crumbling castles in Dracula, but for me personally, it's what lies underground. Darkness and claustrophobia wrapped into a sense of dread as you can feel yourself being watched. So in summary, when I think about the film that contains the most frightening monsters, I think about it having some sort of cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers. I think you know what film I'm talking about here. That's right, it's The Descent. To start, The Descent is a 2005 horror film that was written and directed by Neil Marshall, director of such films as Dog Soldiers and the 2019 Hellboy reboot. The film itself received very positive reviews and made over $57.1 million in the box office versus its relatively small budget of £3.5 million. Suffice to say, horror films can be quite the moneymaker, given that they don't require much of a budget, and as you can tell, this was definitely a financial success. Now as for the sequel, well, that's another story for another time. Moving on. The general plot for this film is that a group of European cave explorers have come to America for a fun-filled spelunking trip. Of course, this trip was done a year after a tragic car accident had deprived the protagonist Sarah, who was played by Shauna MacDonald, of her husband and daughter. Still reeling from the accident, Sarah attempts to compose herself for a great adventure with 5 of her friends. I'm not going to go into detail for most of them as they aren't that memorable, but I will say that Juno, played by Natalie Mendoza, is by far my favorite character in this film. Speaking of the cast, it's hard to remember any other horror film with a predominantly female-led cast that isn't full of complete sleaze or exploitation. I think the only other one off the top of my head is Annihilation, which, if you haven't seen that, I also recommend that you do. I'm sure there are probably other films as well besides those, so feel free to let me know in the comments below. Anyways, moving on, these folks eventually find themselves trapped in a cave. And 50 minutes into the hour-and-a-half film, we finally get into the main conflict with our monsters. As you can tell, it's a ton of build-up, and for some folks it's going to be rather annoying having to wait so long for some creepy cave crawlies to show up, but I personally think it was worth it. We're not given a lot of time to know our characters, and while some are more memorable than others, they're still given enough to set one another apart and to establish a link between them and the audience. I should also mention that the overall plot itself isn't very complex. People get lost in a cave and there are monsters, but the internal conflict that some of our characters face will give you a lot to chew on, because down below, we're all monsters. I mentioned that these are some of the scariest monsters I've ever seen in a film, and I have a good reason. I think it's the environment itself that helps to really establish how much of a threat they are. These are beings, people most likely, who have evolved over thousands or even millions of years to become perfectly adapted to their environment. They may be blind, but they aren't oblivious. The creatures in the film are bat-like in appearance in nature, utilizing sound to help them do their hunting. They are able to cling onto walls and easily sneak up upon their unsuspecting prey. And boy, they show up at the worst moments. They kind of remind me a bit of vampires, with their bat-like features and need to bite and claw at people's throats. Makes me wonder if that was intentional. Maybe in that universe, that's where the vampire legend comes from. Just some food for thought. But for as scary as they are, they still fall second place to the cave itself. I first watched this film when I was a teenager, and at the time I thought these creatures were the scariest thing I'd ever seen. Having rewatched it after so long, I realized it wasn't necessarily the monsters that unnerved me, it was the cave itself. It has sharp drops, twisting narrow tunnels, pitch blackness that our characters easily get lost in, and in that cave the perfect predators live. Things that easily navigate it, that know where to go. It's terrifying in an alien landscape with alien things. The fear of the unknown, a descent into terror. Yeah, see what I did there? I should also mention another thing. Although these monsters are frightening, one-on-one they are much easier for a protagonist to handle, provided that the monsters are deprived of the element of surprise. Which I personally think is fine. These are creatures that are suited for quick ambushes. Although their teeth and claws may be sharp, an ice axe to the head is still going to take one out pretty quick. They are immortal despite their otherworldly appearance, which I think makes for a much more interesting monster. Numbers, however, are where they really excel. Like with any beast, if you get swarmed, there isn't much you can do. If only the protagonist knew that ahead of time. Moving on from our wee beasties, let's talk a bit more about the use of darkness in this film. It's oppressive. It surrounds our characters, and we watch how they have to fight both it and the creatures. Now, I will say that you will probably need a pretty decent environment to watch this film in. At times it can be almost too dark to see, so adjust your blinds accordingly. In this film, that can also be a problem for the audience, because hey, if you can't see the movie, you're basically just listening to audio. I think the filmmakers knew that too, which is why they do everything they can to help both the characters and the audience navigate it. Flashlights, flares, torches, glow sticks, and even a night vision camera help us all through the descent. And I think it's great. It's really cool how each character sort of has their own way of lighting their surroundings and seeing through the darkness. My favorite has to be the red flares, and a natural source of light that covers a world of shadow. In a way you almost don't want them to use those, because of what they might reveal. Honestly, I think the whole film is aged really well. The majority of it is practical effects. The makeup work on some of the injuries folks get in this film are sufficiently gnarly. There are some that even made me look away. There are a few smatterings of CGI, however, and I would say that has probably aged the worst. I think the most egregious example would be some bat effects they used when they first entered the cave, which I understand because I feel like using real bats probably would have been a pain. Now, believe it or not, but the film is actually rather action-packed. It's basically a survival horror film. Remember how I mentioned Juno was my favorite? Well, it could be because she goes all Doomslayer on these cave critters. I think the only game out there that is close to replicating the feel of this film would be The Forest, and even then that game just doesn't compare to the overall feeling of desperation and hopelessness that the fighting in the film has. However, as exciting as the fights are, they can also get a bit disorienting. There are some very quick cuts during the fight scenes that will make you go, what's happening? Of course, after a while, it starts to get into the film's rhythm, but it's still a lot to adjust to. Another thing I want to highlight real quick is the music. I think The Descent has some very beautiful and sorrowful ambient tracks that help set the mood of the film. And there are some really neat, almost tribal drum-sounding bits that help accentuate the terror of the action scenes. However, the dreaded butt trumpets of doom are in the film like so many others. At times, I was almost reminded of the original basement theme in Resident Evil. Finally, I want to touch a bit upon what the themes of this film could be. Now, I'm not the best at reading authorial intent. I'm not very good at reading my own intent at times. But I think the title, The Descent, can have several meanings. There's a literal interpretation, a descent into a cave. into the earth where bloodthirsty creatures live. There's also another meaning, a descent into madness, into fear, and what it takes to overcome it and the pain that life has given you. Sometimes we get lost in that dive down below, where we fear to discover who we really are. Because at the end of the day, what separates us from the beasts? What makes a monster in the end? Some food for thought. So, with all this said and done, The Descent is a film that I say you should experience. As you can tell, I've been a bit vague with a lot of things. I typically try to be as spoiler-free as possible. The film is well shot, well made, and well acted. It can be a bit hard to see at times, and some characters aren't that memorable. But the feeling that it leaves you with is. It's because of this film that I'll never be able to enter another cave ever again. And I guess it isn't because of the monsters necessarily. It's the caves themselves. Something about them just tells you that you shouldn't be in them, because of what you might discover and what you might leave behind. One final thing, apparently there are two endings to this film. The US got a version that was much more happy, while the European version is the original ending. I'm not sure what ending my version on Amazon Prime had. I'll have to check that out later. Thank you all so much for watching this video. It's taken longer to make this than I would have liked. I've been in a bit of a slump recently, but I'm starting to regain control of myself. Hopefully I can do 1 or 2 more videos for Schlocktober. And I should have thought of a better name. However, keep in mind that October isn't the only time where I'll talk about horror stuff. It's just what I exclusively want to focus on for this month. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and tell me what your favorite cave is so I can avoid it. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
He's your biggest fan.
Get out of here, you freaks!